Hoshang, I thought it'd be important for us to catch up and share with our advisor community what we've been discussing privately behind the scenes as we deliver our investment research and recommendations to the investment committees of the financial advisors and asset managers we work with. But because there's been so much that's happening in the markets, we thought it's just good to take stock and kind of explain the thinking of this rapidly changing situation and this changing markets as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, but thank you for all your time early in the mornings, the 7 a.m. calls, the little messages. We try not to overtrade, we try not to overthink, but this has been a massive seismic change whereby the start of the year, things look relatively benign. There was a kind of risk of potential strikes. I think everyone saw that when the aircraft carriers went going. But then actually what's happened now is a complete and total shock. So I think we want to kind of discuss this more broadly, both from a sort of geopolitical perspective and also from a macro perspective. I think today, let's just in this session, let's just focus on the geopolitics first.
That's right. And like you mentioned, markets are in disarray. But let's start from the beginning, Henry. So why do you think, what was the rationale that the US had to initiate this conflict? Like, why did they start this conflict in the first place?
Well, I think, and I think there's a lot's coming out now, and there's lots of some slight kind of behind the scenes leaks and discussions, and I think discontent in the administration, outside the administration in the US around what's been driving this and how, and the preparation or otherwise. But in a way, the rationale, you can see it from one perspective, was clear, and these are for long-standing reasons. So what's been there's some that have been explicitly stated and some that haven't been at all stated. But I think the one that was explicitly stated at the beginning was to achieve a regime change of a long-standing regime that's hostile to the US and Israeli interests, and has also been brutally repressive of its own population. So that was the kind of the day one stated objective. And I think if you recall, when the bombing campaign started, as saying when we're finished, rise up and take back your country. And there's, I think, this huge excitement in some of the Iranian expat community who are looking to hope that the Shah would be reinstalled as a temporary kind of government. There'd be a transition, and it's almost like the Venezuelan regime change was almost so easy in retrospect for the US to achieve, with an exfiltration of the president, a friendly or a US sympathetic alternative lined up in the wings, no US troop losses, just a kind of a rapid special forces operation. It kind of made it kind of almost seem quite easy to achieve a regime change. Whereas I think what's been staggering about this is how it's totally different level of complexity and attrition going on. So the first objective, and that was a stated objective, was to achieve regime change. And given that the US and Iran have been in pretty hostile relationships since the start of the Islamic Republic, 1979, after the revolution, and it actually goes back to further than that. It goes back to the 50s when the US was propping up the original Shah because of Iranian oil. So there's a whole long history which we're not going to be able to cover on this call, and I'm not the expert in either. But if we talk about stated objectives, I think the US was doing this, one, to achieve a regime change of a regime that has been hostile to US and regional interests. The second stated objective, very public, but again, this has been a story for the last 20 years, is to stop Iran from developing a nuclear program that would be an existential threat to Israel and the region. And I think that, again, is a long-standing issue. And I think, again, Trump was very proud, claiming that he had the guts to do what several other previous US presidents could or should have done. But under him, he's actually gone ahead and done it with a devastating attack across the entire Iranian military infrastructure. Yeah. And that contrasts quite heavily to last August, where they just did the kind of bunker buster bombs on the nuclear facilities, which was very targeted. And then Iran did a very almost scripted token retaliation, but nothing really flared up. So I think that was the second main aim. So first, regime change. Second is stopping and obliterating the nuclear program. And I think there's a third indirect one, which is to Iran is a major energy supplier to China. It's the major export revenue for Iran, and it's a major source of security supply for China. And so I think, everything about American foreign policy at the moment is in this context is a geostrategic rivalry with China. So I think the idea of weakening China's China's major source of oil is also a kind of an unstated additional benefit of the action being taken. So I think those are the three aims: regime change, the nuclear program, and a kind of trying to disrupt the kind of Russia, Iran, China axis.
Yeah, and it's basically taken the markets by surprise. I mean, this has come out of nowhere. I don't think anyone was pricing this in the stock markets, nor from a political standpoint. Any of the political advisors and strategists would have expected the US and Israel to start this kind of war. And it did take a lot of people by surprise. So why do you think this was so unexpected, and why now? And yeah, if you could just your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, yes, expected and unexpected. So there's a saying. I think there's a saying by Chekhov that if there's a pistol in Act One, there's a shot in Act Two, and that's in any drama. And I kind of slightly think the same way that if there's an aircraft carrier strike group on the scene in January, well then there could well be sort of strikes in February. Now, despite it being very obvious that Trump was sending in the Navy, same with Venezuela, sent in the Navy in the Caribbean, put a huge strike force. People weren't, as you say, weren't expecting it. But I think that's because in any regional conflict we've seen over decades, or even if there's a negotiation, if you're the president, the presidential administration, the security establishment, you want to create options. So you would say, right, we have a negotiating track over here. And to keep things in check, we've also got a military table over the table as an option over here. And that means that negotiations are more targeted, more focused, and it's a way of exerting pressure. So, it's not the first time the sending of the aircraft carrier per se, or two aircraft carriers eventually, it does not guarantee there'll be military action. But it does mean that it's creating options for the president to make decisions if negotiations were not achieving the target outcome. So I think this did take the Iranians by surprise, because effectively they were in negotiations with the states around the nuclear program about trying to see some compromise, and then the war just started. So it took the Iranians by surprise. It took the West, America's allies, by surprise. Although clearly it had been discussed at a high level with European leaders. If you think back to the Davos, when Trump was particularly cross with Macron over the Greenland foray, he leaked the kind of WhatsApp messages or SMS messages, whatever platform they're using, of his exchange with Macron, and Macron saying, "We're going to do some beautiful things in Iran." So clearly there was a sort of a broader discussion with other leaders about the potential for regime change that the kind of US and Israel was keeping to itself, but it clearly was being discussed, but I think the extent, I don't think much warning was given. Obviously, the British, Keir Starmer, felt that because it was potentially, a sort of preemptive strike, there wasn't legal grounds for giving access, allowing UK bases to be used for strikes, and that obviously really rattled Trump. It's a very non-Churchillian moment from Starmer, where usually the UK stands shoulder to shoulder with the US on these kind of things. So it was unexpected, I think, and it was unexpected to the market, because I think everyone thought this would be kind of well, even if there was big strikes, it'd be a bit like last summer. Some military targets, some nuclear bunkers get sort of blown up, and then the Americans fly home, and everyone sort of talks about it afterwards. But what wasn't expected was effectively this massive bombardment across all of Iran's military infrastructure, and also basically an assassination strike on the Ayatollah and his family, that was basically is what it was. And so I think that was the shock, is that this wasn't just a targeted, oh, let's degrade your nuclear manufacturing capacity. This was, we're going to go to war and we're going to kill your leadership. So it's kind of, I think that was the shock, is that yes, in January they sent in the Navy, but that doesn't mean you're going to use it. And if you do use it, it doesn't mean you're going to do it a wholesale bombardment, as opposed to just focus on specific military installations.
Yeah, and if you think back in history as well, Iran has always faced this kind of existential threat,
yes,
from the US and Israel has faced likewise an existential threat from Iran. And so this is not something, it's been going on for a very long period of time. But I suppose then the Iranian leadership would have planned for such kind of a situation where it could be a large scale war where Western allies could come and bomb Iran. And probably this was one part of their, most companies have a BCP, a business continuity plan. I'm sure the regime had probably a RCP, a regime
well, they have
continuity
this
plan.
Called mosaic leadership. So there's already a contingency plan. I think they learned from the previous kind of campaign. They've also learned from how Israel very successfully dismantled Iran's proxy forces in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, with these targeted assassinations of the kind of militias. And I think the Iranians took note of that, and they had this what's called mosaic government, whereby every leader had a deputy, and regional commanders had existing orders of what to do in the event of a central strike. And so that's why it all kicks off, because everyone's like, right, okay, the HQ may be bombed, and we may have lost our leader, but we know exactly what we need to do, and we have the authority to get on with it. And so I think what shocked everyone was actually the extent of the retaliation. So there's the extent of the bombing by US and Israel, but also what really shocked me was the extent of the retaliation, which suddenly drones being fired at Dubai, the Dubai airport, towards Turkey, towards Cyprus, towards Bahrain. So not just the kind of US military bases, but also civilian infrastructure. And obviously there's always risk of falling debris from from air defenses. So it suddenly became a kind of a conflagration that enveloped the entire Gulf. All Gulf countries are suddenly affected. So that the extent and ferocity of the reciprocal strikes meant that Iran clearly had a plan to, particularly given the new leader's just lost his father, his family. There's no desire to sit down and negotiate. So they are going for a maximalist approach and a maximalist level of retaliation, because they want to make it expensive for those Gulf countries and difficult for those Gulf countries. They want them to exact a heavy price for hosting US military and for not blocking the US on that. They say they would like to be, and I think that'd be an interesting thing we have to work out in the next 5 years, is to what extent will the Gulf see a US presence in there is it protection, or is it attracting a threat? And I think no one was ready for the fact that suddenly the very, very prosperous Gulf region could suddenly be in this kind of crossfires of what previously was always an Iran-Israel exchange. So we've seen Iran-Israel rocket exchanges. Again, last year we had it. It's been a sort of theme going back for years, and it's a horrible situation. But we've never had that where it suddenly impacted the UAE or Dubai or Oman or Bahrain. So the fact it's caught out everyone, I mean that this now is not just an Iran conflict. It's become a pan-Gulf militarization.
And what would you consider like the three trump cards, and no pun intended, the three trump cards that Iran holds that they can actually terrorize or not, or put pressure on the US and the Gulf states?
Well, if you think that America's had a very, very kind of pragmatic approach to basically kind of weakening Iran over the last, America and Israel, because Iran's been an exporter of terrorism, it's been an exporter of threat, it's been a kind of, it's been a dangerous sort of state and non-state actor to US interests. Going back again, you remember the USS Cole back in the 90s, and this has been a theme all our living memories. So, of course, Iran has also been ready for this moment. I mean, ever since the country was founded, it's been a US-Iran loggerheads kind of potential conflict. And so that's been a kind of, well, all our lifetimes. But I think coming up against the world's largest superpower, the world's largest military force, Iran did have three cards, and it's played them. So it hasn't played these cards before because it sort of didn't need to. You had these limited targeted strikes, limited target retaliations, but because this has been about effectively America and Israel saying, right, we're going to take out the regime. They feel under existential threat, and they're not going to go easily. And the regime has shown how. And I think the three things that they've clearly had ready prepared, and is first of all asymmetric warfare. So obviously Iran cannot match US and Israeli firepower. They don't have the same jets, they don't have the same ships, they don't have the same military infrastructure like the US and Israel that has, but they don't need to. So asymmetric warfare is when you have you can do one thing at a different scale or cost to another. So if you can cause as much damage, both economic and psychological, by sending a $40,000 drone into a prosperous nearby city, as you can by launching a expensive high-grade laser-guided ballistic missile or cruise missile. And also the cost of intercepting all those cheap drones is, you're firing a Patriot missile to take out a Shahed drone. The drone costs $40,000 approximately. A missile costs $2 million, and you usually fire two just to be sure. So that kind of running down of inventory of expensive air defenses, because of the sheer volume of cheap drones that the Iranians are sending again and again and again. They have probably thousands of these stored at the bunkers. They've been sitting there making. The first drone attack was at Saudi oil refinery about 5 years ago, and I think suddenly everyone realised that warfare is going to be very different. And in these drones are made of, they're basically like plastic. They're basically very, very big Airfix models. They're not flying particularly fast, but they're cheap and they're plentiful, and they are hard to spot because they're very small and hard to take out. So that asymmetry, likewise, the US Department of Defense, Department of War, it's now called, they said, look, we're going to take out the entire naval fleet, and we've sunk all these Iranian ships. And that may be true, but again, you don't need a ship to cause damage to a US or a US battleship. You need just a speedboat, or you need an explosive carrying speedboat, or a missile carrying speedboat, or a land-based anti-ship missile. You don't need a destroyer. You don't need a battle. Well, think about in the Crimea, you had the Ukrainians managed to sink one of the Russian main battleships with a combination of a drone swarm and a naval drone swarm. So you don't need to have expensive multi-billion-dollar state-of-the-art naval vessels to fight a modern navy. You just need this mosquito fleet and drones, and this is all low cost, and therefore you can fight much nastier and much harder than you could without a huge defense budget. So asymmetric warfare, that is one thing that Iran has got to cause huge trouble to the US and Israeli campaign, and it has done so. So I'd say that's the kind of that's the two of clubs, because it looks very low value, but it actually can cause a lot of disruption. I think the ace card is the economic disruption. So that's the kind of whether it's the ace of diamonds or ace of spades, but probably diamonds because it's money involved. Iran's de facto control of the Strait of Hormuz, and that's where roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes through each day prior to it being closed, means it can hold the world economy to ransom, and that's what's happening at the moment. We think they could partially open it and select friendly tankers through, so China, India, Russia. It's not just that Iran needs those exports as well as the Gulf countries. But the choke point has always been there. And again, the Strait of Hormuz has been talked about as a choke point in maritime terms for decades and decades and decades. But I suppose no one thought it would ever come to this day, whereby it is suddenly under the fire control of Iranian missiles or drones or mosquito fleet. So I think the economic disruption is this closure of the strait. We might get to a partial closure, which would take some pressure off, but means it becomes more selective in terms of security of supply, who's getting their oil from where. But the other risk is also the broader economic risk to the Gulf states in terms of business, tourism, transport links. All of that's being put into question. It was seen as the most prosperous corner of the world. Suddenly, it's kind of caught up in a war zone, and that's always going to have economic damage that could take time to repair. So the economic disruption, it means that Iran is able to, despite being much poorer than the US and having much less kit, it can actually kind of hold the world to ransom through this choke point in the Strait of Hormuz and through basically causing chaos across the Gulf allies of the states. And the third most brutal card that Iran holds is domestic oppression. So that's what we put down as the king of clubs, because we've seen in January that they can put down a civilian uprising very brutally. There's conflicting reports of how many people were executed as a result of that. The internet got turned off. They really made sure they could clamp down on all dissent, and it shows that the Iranian regime is not afraid of brutal and lethal force to put down internal Iranian dissent. So that I think is the third card, and I think that's what's been horrible for to watch from the outside, be it in the West or be it Iranian emigre community. That's been the hardest one to see, but those are the three cards. They've got, in a way, no downside risk. They've got nothing to lose. They're already being bombed. They're already at war, and they're already under pressure, and they don't care what their domestic population thinks. So
what kind of scenarios then you would think how would this play out over the next sort of near term, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months? Like, how would we see that fallout of this?
Well, I think this is the bit that we're all trying to work out. I think when the war started, I think people thought, this could be like a 1 week campaign, just like it was in August last year. Then people realized, actually, no, this could go on for a while. And it's going to go along for a while and cause major disruptions of the Gulf. It's going to take a while and cause major disruptions of the Gulf and global energy markets. So that's why it's kind of almost like ballooned in terms of like impact and shock. So I think Iran will come under pressure from China to keep oil flowing to China. Then the Americans then bombed their main oil loading facility. Then the Iranians then bombed the Qatari LNG facility, and I think they're now trying to de-escalate the impact on the energy. So Trump's asked Israel not to do any campaigns targeting Iranian energy, so that they reduce that reciprocal thing. But is Iran incentivized to play along? Not really. They are fighting for their existence and the survival of their regime, having already lost their entire leadership. So then I don't think the Iranian regime is in a mood to sit down and have constructive peace negotiations, because there's no immediate benefit to them. So I think they and even if they do end up with a ceasefire whereby the drones and the missiles, the bombing all stops, the kinetic phase, if you like. And Trump will want that to stop because he wants to claim victory and focus on the midterm elections. But I think Iran will still keep the strait effectively closed to the West and have allowing what we call selective passage for friendly nations through. So if it's China, if oil going to China, it can go through. If it's oil going to Russia, it can go through. If it's oil going to non-aligned India, who's kind of staying out of all of this, then it can go through. But if it's all going to Korea or to Japan or to Europe, then forget it. It can't move. So I think that's the partial closure, and I think that's probably the most likely scenario. And if we look back at the Yom Kippur War, which is 1973, when following that war, the Gulf all collectively blockaded the Gulf. That blockade lasted for 6 months, and that was the first time that the West woke up to the fact that that supply route was such a choke point, and they were such a high dependency, and that why US was always policing the Gulf from that point onwards. But so it took 6 months for people to climb down and to negotiate and to work out compromise, work out a way forward. So if you think this started at end of February, that would take us to end of August before there's a kind of any full reopening. But that's assuming that they can reach an agreement. If, however, for some miracle, the US and Iran decide to sit down and have constructive negotiations, which I think at this stage feels less likely. I don't think there's any upside for Iran to do that at the moment. Then you could see a partial closure being shorter, let's say 1 to 3 months, in which there will be less disruption to the oil price. And I think the other thing being debated, we just don't know, is there is potential, there's discussion around an expeditionary force of landing some Marines to kind of actually physically control the choke point at the Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point. And there's a ship on the way, it's an amphibious assault ship on the way, and that would be a huge decision for Trump to take, to actually commit ground troops, having literally campaigned about the kind of forever wars of the past and how he didn't want to repeat or rerun of Iraq or rerun of Afghanistan. So that is a kind of tail risk event, but I think that they'd be putting them very much in harm's way because they don't have air superiority, they've got air dominance, they're at risk of these asymmetric threats of drones, of mosquito fleets. It's not as straightforward as prior engagements or conventional warfare that was there in the Iraq War. So I think that my big concern is there's no off button to all of this. With Trump and his sanctions policy, he was able to say, "Oh, we're going to put sanctions on the whole world on Liberation Day." Then when the bond market started shaking, he was able to say, "Okay, we're going to pause it and regroup and work out." So he's able to. You could hit the pause button, but there's no pause button with war. And also, this is not just a US military action. This is Israel as well, and also, there's lots of countries who've been hit by Iran, who have a right to retaliate, to have a right to have their own kind of agenda, if you like, in terms of how they conclude a peaceful settlement with Iran. So it's a multilateral conflict.
Yeah.
So it was easy for Trump to decide to start this alongside Israel. It's been much harder to just unilaterally just say, right, it's over now. So he keeps on saying, oh, it's not going to go on forever. It's we've done the thing, it's going to our timetable, but that's not necessarily in Trump or the US administration's gift. It's also, at what point does Iran want to stop disrupting the region, because they can. And I think that's been the scary realization, is that like any war, it's a war of attrition, and it's a numbers game. If Iran can send more drones than America and the Gulf can fire Patriots, you get to a point where one is able to inflict more damage and pain on the other. So yeah, I'd like to think, I always like to think things will end quicker than they do, but I think my concern is there's no incentive for Iran to stop maximizing the pain and cost to US and global economy. At this stage.
Makes sense. Absolutely. No, thanks, Henry, for sharing this insight into the war that's ongoing. It's been a very challenging time for the population, as well as from the Iranian population, as well as the Gulf population.